right to health, adequate health care, and adequate health rather than health care, has the right to adequate health, the state has an obligation to seek international assistance. So here's the question. Though the population may be obligated, or the state may be obligated to seek such assistance, is there a corresponding obligation to help, right? And this is the point, right? If we say that the population here, right, the population has a right to health, and that right corresponds to a duty for the state to provide that right, and then we see that insofar as the state cannot in and of itself provide that right, it is obligated to seek international assistance. Right? I have a right, we have a right to seek health, adequate health. The corresponding obligation duty is that of the state. If the state can't satisfy that obligation, it now transfers the duty, right? The duty is now transferred. You should see this, right? The duty is now transferred. Right? The duty is transferred to the international level. And the question is, at an international level, can we then say that internationally, this is just a point for discussion, the obvious answer is yes, obviously, but the more sort of astute answer is recognizing that the attempt to place an international burden on the local health concerns for a particular group of people within a sovereign nation is a huge obligation to put on an international community. I am in no sense saying that there shouldn't be this burden, right? But what I'm saying is it's very easy to say that insofar as the state cannot adequately provide for the health of its, not healthcare, but provide for the health of its population, that it must then shift that burden to the international arena, international assistance. It's a whole other thing to say, well, now do I have that obligation? Right? Is it fair to say that because I now have the obligation to assist, because each one of the respective members of the international community has its own constituents that it needs to take care of, right? So it's a very, very difficult, I think, discussion to have, but I think it's important that we first recognize the right to health, and then also recognize explicitly how difficult it is at times to satisfy those rights, and the difficulty in even negotiating the international assistance, right? How is that assistance going to ultimately look insofar as outside state actors are going to directly contribute to improving the health of constituents that aren't part of their sovereignty, right? Very difficult assessment. Okay, so that's that. Next, specifically now to look at what really is and has become sort of the hallmark, sort of calling card, and there's been a lot done on this topic, so I'm not going to go into too much depth because there's tons and tons of information, there's tons and tons of resources out there. I just wanted to address it. I'm going to go through this rather quickly because, again, enough has already been done. Not enough has been done, you can always do more, but there's a lot of information out with respect to the right to health and AIDS, HIV. I wanted to spend a lot of time on things that were less covered, for example, food security. Not a lot there, so I spent 2 hours discussing that. With respect to HIV, AIDS, and human rights, there's a ton of information, so I'm going to go over this information rather quickly. Right, so the right to health and HIV, AIDS. Okay, so first, December 4th, I didn't have the last date. I don't know why I didn't have the date. I have to put that down there. I don't know the date, so I need to check that. So on December 4th, the International Convention on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, the right to the highest attainable standard of health. Here's just a block quote, and I'm going to read some of the quote so that you have it. Okay, so the covenant proscribes any discrimination in access to health care and underlying detriments of health as well as the means and entitlements of their procurement on the grounds of race, color, sex, language, religion, political, blah, 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 including HIV/AIDS, sexual orientation, blah, 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 which has the intention or the effect of nullifying or impairing the equal enjoyment of exercise of these rights to health, right? So you can't discriminate, as was stated in the ICESCR convention. You cannot discriminate on the basis of having AIDS, right? Medical practitioners are obligated to provide the same level of care that they would provide to a patient were that patient not to have AIDS, right? So with respect to discrimination, obviously you can imagine that it places a burden on medical practitioners, but the idea is an individual who has HIV/AIDS is entitled, has the right, as we said before, not to be discriminated against, not to be experimented on, and they have the right to equal access of healthcare. So if I'm denied based on my having AIDS, that is a violation of my human rights. So it's important to recognize that point. Next, international attempts are made to safeguard against discrimination for those suffering with HIV/AIDS, right? And this is exactly why the Convention on Economic and Social Cultural Rights incorporated this discourse on non-discrimination for patients with HIV/AIDS, right? It's not just an individual country's role or obligation. It is a global obligation for global health practitioners to offer and provide equal care for individuals, irrespective of whether or not they have HIV/AIDS and such. Next is a quote. I want to talk about it just a little bit. I'm not going to get into too much detail on the quote because it's pretty self-explanatory. But if you look at the quote, listen to the following quote. It's from page 204 rather, in the text. Quote, "The links between stigma, discrimination, and denial of the right to enjoy the highest attainable standard of health are complex and multifaceted. Together, discrimination and stigma amount to a failure to respect human dignity." So we'll stop there for a second, right? When we're talking about discrimination, right? When we're talking about the idea of discrimination and the stigma associated with having HIV/AIDS, right? Obviously, early in the 80s, late 80s especially, the idea was, oh, if you have AIDS, then you're a homosexual, or if you have AIDS, well, you're HIV, you got HIV/AIDS from intravenous drug use, right? So it was like a really detestable, perverted segment of society. Obviously, I don't believe this, but this is the idea, right? The idea was, and in a sense, it wasn't that the population was detestable and perverted. There was legitimacy that the spread of AIDS initially occurred within certain segments of the population, but the idea to then demonize those segments of the population, to attach a stigma to them, or even to go so far, many religious leaders, I'm not going to go into a whole religious discussion, then said it was condemnation from the divine to rebuke all of the sodomites, and I mean the language got pretty vulgar. It got pretty base, right? What we have to recognize is that we're talking about human beings. We're talking about people. We're talking about people who are suffering from a disease. Insofar as we're talking about human beings, we have to recognize that they still retain their rights as human beings. So if they need medical treatment, if they need medical care, and they do need medical care, they being individuals afflicted with HIV/AIDS, then there is an obligation that members of the medical community have to satisfy those needs, right? It's undeniable. So together, discrimination and stigma amount to a failure to respect human dignity, right? So if you are actively practicing acts of discrimination, if you are actively stigmatizing individuals who have AIDS, then you are failing to respect human dignity, right? You are failing to respect human dignity. And equality by devaluing those affected, right? Often adding to the inequalities already experienced by vulnerable, marginalized groups. So it's already the case that individuals who are suffering from HIV/AIDS have to deal with stigmas of having the disease. How did you get the disease? What type of lifestyle were you living?